Hi, I'm Sterling Watts from dailyunconstitutional.com. Subject I'm going to talk about today is the Federal Reserve. There's been a lot of misunderstanding, probably complete lack of understanding about what the Federal Reserve actually is, and only in the last few years is the public in general beginning to awaken and figure out what the Federal Reserve indeed is. It's neither federal nor does it really have a reserve. Now, economists have been warning for decades about an inevitable crash in the value of the dollar, and the thing is that the voice has been out there for so long that most Americans have stopped taking it seriously and think it's just a big joke. It's just a bunch of talk. After all, the Federal Reserve has bailed us out of every recession we've ever had. Why shouldn't they just be able to keep on doing what they've always done? But the fact is, they've been doing what they've always been doing for a long time, and the effects are becoming more and more drastic. What caused the economic downturn in the first place? Not enough Americans understand yet that the real problem is that which claims to be our savior, and that's the Federal Reserve itself. I'm not going to talk a lot about what the Federal Reserve is in this video. It takes too much time, but we'll cover that another time. But the fact is that until the late 70s, the U.S. economic plane had already been on a long, gradual descent, maybe starting back as early as the first Depression. The American people are the passengers in this economic plane, and the captain is the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve keeps assuring us that everything's fine. The captain keeps pulling back on the stick, but nothing the captain can do can get the plane under control. He wrestles with it. He sees it's going to crash to the ground, but in the meantime, he announces over the PA system, "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare for a comfortable landing, sit back and enjoy the flight." That's pretty much an analogy of what's going on, and it's the Federal Reserve that's piloting the crash. What does the Federal Reserve do? The Federal Reserve is best known for printing money, but it also carries out the very same manipulations that its printing of currency is designed to correct. Its theoretical job is to control the cash supply to keep the economy in balance, but the fact is the economy doesn't need outside forces to keep it in balance. It can remain balanced naturally. And among other tricks, the Federal Reserve manipulates the economy by controlling interest rates, printing and circulating cash, and selling bonds, doing these things when certain cues arise in response to which way are the graphs going. Selling bonds is a big thing. In plain language, selling bonds is a kind of a trick word for borrowing money. It sounds like the government's selling something. What they're actually doing is creating money by borrowing it from investors, people who are willing to invest in the United States economy. Why is the federal government now $17 trillion in debt? Well, for 100 years they've been overselling these bonds. A bond is a loan to the government from an investor. And it's a vehicle that's used to inject cash back into circulation by just borrowing it. Borrowing it from whomever. Now, when individuals get into a pinch, like you or I, we may have to go to the bank and get a loan, and we might be turned down, we might be granted a loan. That would depend on our credit score. Well, the federal government has to do the same thing when they run out of money. But it doesn't have to get any approval to get funded. It just goes to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve can do one of things. It can one of two things. It can either print money out of thin air, or it can borrow currency, often from other economies that are stronger than ours, by selling bonds. Selling a promise to repay investors. That's what bonds are. And the result is that the government always gets its funding. It either goes and prints some money, or it sells bonds, or, in other words, it goes and borrows the money it needs to pay its bills. And the result is that the dollar continually loses value. Now, a lot of people ask, well, doesn't the government have a savings account to fall back on? How about the Federal Reserve, what's called the Reserve? The Federal Reserve is the government savings account, and currently it has a balance in it of something like $56 billion, which sounds like quite a nice sum of money. Sounds like a nice amount of money for an entire nation to have in its savings account. But it's nothing at all unless you take the entire balance into account. You got to look at the balance sheet for the entire country. We've got $56 billion in the bank, but we owe $17 trillion in debt. And that's not to mention the unfunded obligations that the government has to pay for. On top of that, that includes things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, a million other social programs that I'm sure we could list dozens of them if we wanted to. But that amounts to hundreds of millions of dollars in annual obligations as well. Where do they get the money to pay for these things? They got two options. They can either borrow it by selling bonds, or they can print it out of thin air. And they've been doing a lot of both. Now, let's look at those numbers on an individual basis, because you may think to yourself, well, $56 billion, that's quite a reasonable sum. But not when you have a $17 trillion debt. Let's divide these numbers down by a factor of 1,000,000 to put them in a perspective of the amounts of cash that real people commonly hold. Let's take $56 billion and divide it by 1,000,000. It means you've got $56,000 in your savings account. Now we'll take 17 trillion and divide it by 1,000,000. It means you've got 17 million in debts. Now imagine if you had a $56,000 savings account, but you owed $17 million on the mortgage of your house, and you were having trouble paying your bills. Where would you get the money? Well, you might say, well, you just got to go out and get a really well-paying job and create the money. That's not what the Federal Reserve does. It doesn't create valuable money to pay for the debts. It prints it. Or it buys more debt, sells more bonds. Now, if you were like the Federal Reserve, when you get in a pinch like this, you've got a $56,000 savings account and $17 million mortgage, and let's say you've got a $100,000 a month payment to make on your house. Well, if you were like the Federal Reserve, you could just go to the garage and get out your counterfeit printing press and print some dollars and take them to the bank. That is exactly parallel with what the Federal Reserve does. They're not creating real money. Money is a reflection of economic activity. That's not economic activity, that's paper. So national debt continues to grow out of control because the federal government continues to turn to the Fed to get unlimited supplies of cash. No questions ever asked. So that's what you really need. You got to take this warning seriously. This can't go on forever. It's been rising to the crescendo, and we're just about at the crescendo where we're going to go over the edge and there's going to be a severe drop. And we've been rising on this curve for decades. And this is something that the public is not really aware of right now. We're at the peak, and we're just about to go over the edge and fall. If you really want to find out more about this, I would recommend that you look into Jim Rickard's new book called Currency Wars He wrote two different books. Currency Wars is one of them. His most recent book is called The Death of Money. Both of them are great resources for information on understanding how the economy works and what a mess we're really in. And that's my summary of the economy for the day. I'm going to move on to another topic, and I thank you for listening. If you go to the link in the description below to our website, dailyunconstitutional.com, I recommend you do that. Thanks. Talk to you later.